I direct your attention to the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 20, and I'll begin reading at verse 1. Follow along or just listen carefully, but listen because within these words there is God's word for the living in our community. For the kingdom of heaven is like a landowner who went out early in the morning to hire laborers for his vineyard. After agreeing with the laborers for the usual daily wage, he sent them into his vineyard. And when he went out about 9 o'clock, he saw others standing idle in the marketplace. And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard, and I will pay you whatever is right." And so they went. When he went out again about noon, and about 3 o'clock, he did the same. And about 5 o'clock he went out and found others standing around, and he said to them, "Why are you standing here idle all day?" And they said to him, "Because no one has hired us." And he said to them, "You also go into the vineyard." And when evening came, the owner of the vineyard said to his manager, "Call the laborers and give them their pay, beginning with the last and then going to the first." When those who were hired about 5 o'clock came, each of them received the usual daily wage. Now when the first came, they thought they would receive more, but each of them also received the usual daily wage. And when they received it, they grumbled against the landowner, saying, "These last worked only 1 hour, and you have made them equal to us who have borne the burden of the day and the scorching heat." But he replied to one of them, "Friend, I am doing you no wrong. Did you not agree with me for the usual daily wage? Take what belongs to you and go. I chose to give to the last the same as I give to you. Am I not allowed to do what I choose with what belongs to me? Or are you envious because I am generous?" This is the word of God. Thanks be to God. Amen. Wow, what was Jesus thinking? Huh? In fact, that's really the hardest part about these parables, isn't it? Trying to get to what Jesus was thinking. And part of the struggle is that after the resurrection, after Jesus' death and resurrection, everything that Jesus taught took on a whole different tune. In fact, the Apostle Paul, who was the first writer of our New Testament, begins not with the teachings of Jesus. In fact, you find very few things in the writings of Paul to the letters of the church that Paul wrote that really teach us what Jesus said or what Jesus taught. Paul's almost entire focus is on the meaning of Jesus in light of the resurrection. And so we don't hear, even later on from the church, the specific teachings of Jesus until much later in the latter part of the first century. And so it's very hard to pull off all the layers from the Apostle Paul to great leaders and great saints from St. Augustine to Thomas Aquinas to Martin Luther to John Wesley to Calvin and probably a lot of the preachers that you grew up listening to along the way. All of these layers telling us the importance and the significance of these eternal kinds of teachings of Jesus. But what if we could peel all of that off, put all of that away, and just hear Jesus in the first third, the first 30 or 40 years, in that first century, Jesus speaking to everyday, ordinary people like you and I, but especially like those who were workers in the vineyards and who were landowners in the communities in which Jesus traveled to. That's really what Jesus did, didn't he? He traveled throughout Galilee, and when he was up in the northern part by the Sea of Galilee, he talked about things that related to fishermen, right? He called them to become fishers of men. He gave instances of preaching actually from boats and of throwing their nets into the water and fishing and gathering and calming the storms. All of those things in that part of the world that would relate to the sea and to boats and to fishing. When he traveled throughout all of the other parts of Galilee that were steeped in wheat fields, he gave teachings related to that. When he and his disciples went through cornfields, he gave sayings related to that. There were olive groves everywhere. And when Jesus came through vineyards and he arrived in those communities where maybe there were bread being baked in community ovens, he gave sayings and parables related to that. When people came to him with questions about how do we relate to one another in our family life, he gave us parables about that. Here is Jesus giving us very ordinary, everyday kinds of teachings. Unfortunately, after the resurrection and the church began to try to decide what do all these things mean, we began to turn parables into allegories, where allegories meaning that we assign characters to all the various characters within the parables to add to some sort of a divine and higher purpose in our learning. But what if we could just hear Jesus as someone in the first century of Jewish heritage, living in a community where there were wheat fields and olive groves and vineyards, and people standing around in the marketplace looking for work in order to survive, and landowners that had vineyards that needed workers to go there and to pick the grapes and to make the wine. What if we could just hear this as an ordinary story about how we relate together in the workplace and in the communities? You see, if we strip everything away from what we have been taught and learned about the teachings of Jesus, and we sort of lined up all of the things that Jesus felt were important in life by the volume and the weight, the sheer weight of his teachings, you know what we would find? Jesus taught more about the economy of our community, about our possessions and our wealth and how we relate to those than he did everything else that he taught about. So why shouldn't this teaching of Jesus simply be about how we live together in the everyday work of those who have jobs to offer and people who are looking for a place to work? Last winter, late in the fall, we took a family vacation. It was our middle daughter's 30th birthday. And she wanted to celebrate it with the family. And because she and her husband, Red, enjoy traveling, she became our travel agent. She made all the arrangements, just said, here's what we're going to do, pay here. And we shared the cost of all that. One of the delightful things that she did was to arrange for us to tour a vineyard. And what really made it delightful, because we weren't expecting this, is that the person who gave us the tour was the vineyard owner and his wife. And they literally entertained us. And I learned so much about vineyards and the work and making wine. For example, I didn't realize that grapevines don't like a lot of water. Now that sounds kind of strange. I mean, the Panhandle, they have vineyards in the Panhandle because they don't get a lot of rain up there. Vineyards, wine stalks don't like a lot of water, and so one of the great things is they plant them on hillsides so that when it does rain, the water runs off. And the most ideal thing in this vineyard that this gentleman was showing us about was that the castle, the home, was at the top of the hill, and all the vines and the vineyards ran off on either side. And there was 144 acres of vineyard. That's a lot. That's a lot to take care of. And what he also told us was there was lots of work in terms of trimming and planting and looking after and making sure everything was just right. And the most intense part of the work, even though he had actually only, I think, 4 full-time employees that lived on the vineyard, whenever the harvest time came, that number of workers multiplied by 5, 6, 7, 8 times that number, because it took that many, because when the grapes were exactly ready to be picked, they had to be picked, they had to be processed, and you had to have the people on hand to do that. The other interesting thing was that each side of that hill, some on the east side where the sun would rise, and some on the west side where the sun would set, they always ripened at different times. One, because some were exposed to more sun than others, and some were exposed during the cool of the day when in the afternoon, some sides of the hill were exposed to much more heat. And some in between got a little bit less of all. And so you had to check day by day, almost hour by hour, to see what was being ready to pick and get it picked just as quickly as possible. It was one interesting insight into an industry that I know very little about. But you can see here in this village that Jesus is talking to, probably surrounded by vineyards, why it would be so important for the master, who knew that it was time to harvest, would arrive at the first sign of daylight and hire everyone he could. And then maybe later, seeing that it would be important that others be hired because the work was getting behind, he went back at 9 o'clock and at noon and at 3 o'clock. And even at 5 o'clock, the last hour of the day, he needed more workers. And so he came back to the marketplace and said, I need you to work. I need you to go. I'll pay you whatever is fair. And so Jesus tells that story. And my guess is he was talking to people who were laborers in the vineyard. He was talking to those who were landowners. And he was talking to them about how do we live together in community. And so when Jesus gets to the end of the parable, and he tells the story about how those who were hired last and only worked 1 hour were paid the same daily wage, a full day's wage. And those that were hired at 3 o'clock in the afternoon and noon and 9 o'clock were paid each a full day's wage, as well as those who were hired the very first thing in the morning and worked all through the heat of the day, all receiving exactly the same. You can imagine they began to grumble, right? We have worked all day through the heat of the day, and you pay us the same? And the householder, the vineyard owner, says, I gave you what we agreed to. I have done nothing wrong. I have not taken anything away from you. If I choose to be generous, can I do that with what is mine? You see, when we hear that, we often hear that from our perspective in life, which is usually as those who are the householder and the landowner and the ones that have jobs to offer, don't we? Because we kind of hold that place in our society and culture. But what if you were on the other side of that? What if you were a laborer in the vineyard? How would Jesus be speaking to you? Because you see, one of the things it says in that story, as Jesus tells it, is that at 9 o'clock, there were people in the vineyard that were in the marketplace that weren't there at 6 o'clock. And at noon, when he went back, there were still more people who were there waiting to be employed who were not there earlier in the day. There's a sense where Jesus is telling both sides of this story that there is an obligation in the community for you to be diligent if you are a laborer and to be generous if you are a landowner or a householder. If you have work to give work. Seek out those who need the employment and make that happen. You see, we're getting some of both sides in Jesus' teaching, are we not? How do we live together in community? How are we responsible to one another in our life together? Now, that's not unique to our Christian faith or our Christian teachings, because if you go back into the life of Judaism and you read in the book of Leviticus, you find some of the very same understandings and ideas, where the law of Moses said that when you harvest your field, don't harvest your fields right up to the turn row, right up to the very end. Leave that. Leave that for those who are the poor in the community, that they might come and gather that. Leave that for the aliens, literally saying that, those who are strangers in the land, those who don't belong, those who are sojourners. Leave enough for them who have nothing, who are passing through, who are not part of the landowning and working community, that they also might have something to gather for bread. And the same thing applied in the vineyards. Don't harvest everything. Leave some for those who are poor to come and to gather, that they too might survive in the community. It's not unusual in the very beginnings of Judaism as well as in Christianity for Jesus to tell a parable like this, or to see how that is carried out in the life of the church, because we see there that what did the church do? They became the carers and the givers for those who were orphans, for the children and for the homeless, those who were widows in the community who had no one to care for them. There was a sense whereby we care for the people in our community and those who have great needs. The early part of my ministry, I've told you before, was lived out in the panhandle of Texas. That was rather a strange place for me, having been raised in South Louisiana. Different climate, different kind of living. My grandfather was just a poor dirt farmer, but he probably farmed no more than 10 acres, 15 acres. I moved out into the west part of Texas with giant farms and massive tractors that plowed sections and sections of land. But I learned something in my very first community, and all the other communities outside of the major cities I learned, is that agricultural business was the life of the community. The farmers would plant wheat early in the fall, and then they would put cattle on it to graze on the wheat. I had farmers, I had ranchers, I had cattle brokers, I had bankers. All of those were in the church. And all of them relied on this business. The cattle were brought in, they would put them on the wheat, they would eat the wheat until the wheat was ready sometime in February or March, and they would take the cattle off and send them to the feedlot. There were other farmers that raised corn and milo that would be turned into feed to feed the cattle. So this was an industry right there in the community. It didn't have to go outside of the community. It took care of everything and hired the workers from within the community that was needed. And everybody, every level of this, whether you were a banker, whether you were a farmer, a rancher, a school teacher, everybody in the community relied on that business. They all had it in common. Even the church life, depending on how prosperous was the prices, the offerings were related to that. And how many times I'd hear at the time of the year when we negotiated staff salary saying, well, you know, preacher, it's been a tough year in farming. I lived in that community. I understood how everything related across the board. And so Jesus tells this parable about how we live in community. And what he says is, what is fair is not always enough, right? What is fair is not always what is right. Sometimes it is about generosity and about kindness. Why? Because we live in this community together. That the laborers are dependent upon the landowners. But the landowners are just as dependent upon the laborers as well. And we live together, and we work together, and we support one another in this community. Now, you might not guess it from what we do on Sunday morning, but in the life of the church, we know a lot about being poor and needy. If you are one of those who works as a volunteer on Monday and Tuesday in our office, you see the poverty of our community coming to the church, needing help, needing something to help them make ends meet at the end of the month, to provide electricity so their homes will be warm or cool, and provide food for their children. It sometimes is a very frustrating act of being kind and generous, because you can never help everybody that comes and provide all of what their needs are. And sometimes you have to be very discerning and deciding, and you can help this, but you can't help that one. You can help with this, but you can't help with that. In order to be sort of fair and just. But you know what? We provide a lot of kindness and generosity. Now, it'd be one thing for us to blame those who are poor, blame them for being poor and needy, and maybe not having the same values and the same way of managing their life and their finances as you and I do. And it may not always be fair to be asked to take care of someone else. But you know what? The Bible teaches us through the teachings of Jesus that sometimes what is fair and what is just is not enough. That sometimes it simply calls for generosity in the midst of grace and love. Because after all, would we want God to give to us only what we deserve? Or is it that God is much more generous and filled with grace than we could ever imagine? And possibly, if there is one little iota of where we might insert a character quality in this parable and make it an allegory, I would probably permit you to do that if you saw the landowner as God, the one who gives to us much more generously than we deserve. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.